Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics, but first up, to go back to Syria, you might remember a couple of weeks ago when the bombing took place in eastern Ghouta. At that time, I think we were reporting 250 civilian deaths. Now that number is more than 10 times that, and so we want to talk about the Syrian civil war, what has been happening there, the use of chemical weapons, the humanitarian crisis, and most importantly, what we can do about that. And so I hope that as we get into this conversation, if you'd like to join the conversation, ask a question, make a comment, we would love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. I bring first to the microphone Vernon Brewer, and he is the CEO and actually the founder of World Help. It's a Christian humanitarian organization committed to serving the physical and spiritual needs of people in a lot of these impoverished communities around the world. And since its inception, back in 1991, World Help has delivered humanitarian aid to about 82 million people in 70 countries. He is an individual that, of course, has a family. His wife, Patty, they oftentimes are seen out there in the ball field cheering on their grandsons, and certainly as an individual that can give us some perspective. So, Vernon, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby. It's good to be with you.
I would love to maybe educate our people. We do talk about a lot of these humanitarian groups, but we haven't spent much time talking about World Help. This may be, as far as I can tell, the first time we've had you on Point of View. So explain that for just a minute, because we have a link to your website. And, of course, one of the action items for our people is to go to your website. And so we will encourage people to simply look at what is available there, and certainly encourage them to get involved with what you're doing. But give us a little bit of the genesis of World Help, if you might.
Well, we started 27 years ago. Our goal and our focus is to provide help for today and hope for tomorrow. We do the help for today through humanitarian aid, as you've already mentioned. And as a Christian humanitarian organization, we provide hope for tomorrow through Bible distribution, church planting all around the world, mostly in persecuted countries.
Right. And, of course, as people go to worldhelp.net, one of the first things that pops out is give water, give life. So even though we're going to focus a lot of time and attention today on Syria, there are just a variety of different projects that you've been involved with. And so before we let you go, I want to talk a little bit more about various ways people can partner with you. But can you give us kind of an overview? We've talked about the war in Syria, but it would probably be helpful just for everybody's sense of perspective to talk a little bit about how did that develop and how long has it been going in terms of the humanitarian crisis that it has precipitated?
Well, Kirby, the Syrian civil war actually began on March 15, 2011. It's hard to believe that it's been 7 years ago last month. It started with a series of public demonstrations and government reactions that soon escalated in a full-scale civil war. It's important to know that it's more than a battle, though, between those who are for or against President Assad. The government's key allies, as we know, are Russia and Iran, while the United States and Turkey and Saudi Arabia have backed the rebels. ISIS has been allowed in the past 7 years to take foothold and to flourish. Russia, which already had a military presence with military bases in Syria, launched a full-scale campaign to support Assad. And while the Russian military claims to strike only terrorists, as we all know, they also attack and kill rebels and civilians as well. And Iran is funding a lot of the civil war. They've sent in hundreds of troops and spent billions of dollars to help Assad. The statistics are staggering. More than 5.4 million people have fled Syria because of the conflict. Another 13 million, well over half the population, are displaced within the country, according to the UNHCR. It's been estimated that more than 400,000 people have been killed and are missing. And they've had multiple ceasefires through the years that have been called for by the UN and other international bodies, but these ceasefires have repeatedly been violated, and the fighting has continued. And so it's a very complex situation, and there's really no clear end to the conflict in sight.
And it's hard sometimes, even from a foreign policy point of view, to figure out which side to get behind, because we got questions on all sides, as you, I think, alluded to. I mentioned just a minute ago, we talked a while back about the bombing that took place back in about mid-February in eastern Ghouta. And that time we were talking about 250 casualties. Now I'm looking at some of the numbers you have here, 1,500 people. And, of course, then just the use of chemical and biological weapons. Tell us about what's happening there in eastern Ghouta.
Yeah, eastern Ghouta is an agricultural region. It's home to about nearly 500,000 people on the outskirts of Damascus. And because of its proximity to the Syrian capital, eastern Ghouta is a strategic location for the civil war. And on Sunday, February 19th, the Syrian government forces began a relentless bombardment against the civilians of eastern Ghouta, and it's turned out to be one of the deadliest attacks of the entire war. In just 30 days, I just saw this warning, the death toll is now up to 1,600 people. 300 of those are children, and many hundreds and thousands more injured. In fact, in the 7 years, 1.5 million people have permanent disabilities because of the war. 86,000 Syrians have lost one or more limbs.
Yes.
And there have been confirmed reports that chlorine gas, which is a biological weapon, has been used during the siege, which is just unfathomable. The Syrian government has all but completely reclaimed eastern Ghouta from the moderate rebels, but it's going to be a long time before the refugees can return, if ever. So imagine countless homes, businesses, schools, hospitals, all destroyed. It's a war zone.
It is. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about the humanitarian situation, and most importantly, what people can do through you, through World Help, to provide something. And again, we have a link to worldhelp.net. Of course, we also just encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. You can find out a little bit more. Some great material there. It tells you a little bit more about the mission, some of the things that they do, child sponsorship, ways to give. And because of what has been taking place in Syria, which was even in the news over the weekend, I thought it would be appropriate to spend just a few more minutes with an individual that has certainly spent his time and energy working in that regard, Vernon Brewer, CEO and founder of World Help. We have links to the website. We'll talk more about what you can do right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The ongoing debate about how to stem the problem of gun violence in America has often been fueled by inaccurate statistics and faulty conclusions. If we are to craft effective public policy concerning gun violence, we should insist that accurate facts and figures be available to citizens and legislators. First, let's at least acknowledge that violent crime has been dropping for decades. Lots of recent media attention make it seem like violence is on the upswing. It is not. For example, the homicide rate in 2011 was almost half the rate in 1991. The gun-related death rate in 2013 was half of the rate in 1993. Of course, we still hear and read about how dangerous various places in America are. That is true because most of the murders are concentrated in a few areas. Over half of all murders occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and a high percentage of those murders are linked either to gang or drug activity. Second, a very high percentage of gun deaths are due to suicides. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention each year publish data on gun deaths. In every year, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes by as much as 2 to 1. Third, most murders and other shootings are done with handguns, not rifles. The FBI Uniform Crime Report shows that gun-related homicides are done with handguns, and rifles account for less than 3% of gun-related homicides. Fourth, often we can predict what sort of person who will commit a murder or a mass shooting. Significant percentages of men who commit murder are in a gang or using drugs or an abuser in a troubled relationship. A high percentage of mass shooters have extensive histories of mental illness. These facts and many others need to be included in our debate about gun violence in America. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Vernon Brewer, and again, he's the CEO and founder of World Help, organizations that existed since 1991, and you can find out more about them in our website, pointofview.net, or simply go to their website, which we'll give in just a minute. And, of course, some of you in the past have, a matter of fact, not some of you, a large percentage of you, in one way or another, have helped those refugees. Some of those were refugees from Syria, some were refugees from Iraq or other places, and we've provided that opportunity. So let's again maybe talk, if we could, Vernon, for just a few minutes about the humanitarian crisis there. We'll just talk about Eastern Ghouta for just a minute, but all of Syria, and most importantly, what World Help is doing and how people can aid you to help those. Talk about that, if you might.
Thank you, Kirby. I've been on the ground in the region more than 20 times in the last 7 years, and I can tell you that the bloody siege and bombardment in Eastern Ghouta has created a major humanitarian crisis that's affecting hundreds of thousands of people. It's estimated at least 100,000 people have already fled the city to nearby Damascus, and more continuing to trickle out as the fighting dies down. There are still nearly 250,000 people living in Eastern Ghouta, and they are facing critical humanitarian need. The siege obviously has caused a food crisis. Food prices have skyrocketed and been inflated by 140%. And in any crisis like this, it's the children who are suffering the most from malnutrition, disease, injuries from biological weapons, nerve damage, and leaving the area is nearly impossible. even when they called for evacuations, it's kind of more easily said than done, as everything from landmines to sniper fire keep people from leaving. And the government is letting very few people out. They create humanitarian corridors, but as it's happened before during the war, the fighting has prevented refugees from getting out and prevented helping civilians and prevented even delivering the humanitarian aid. Our teams and partners on the ground are located in the heart of Damascus, so we're in a perfect position to help those who are fleeing Ghouta and need immediate assistance. We're distributing supplies such as food and bottled water and medicine and hygiene kits and infant formula and everything needed to survive. But because there are so many people fleeing Damascus, we are in desperate need of all of those items because there's just no end to the need as more and more refugees come in every day. So we're beginning to run out of these items. You know, when you look at a situation like this, you see the images on the news, it's heartbreaking, and sometimes it's paralyzing to think, well, what can one person do?
Yes.
But we can provide for just $35 enough life-saving essentials to one Ghouta refugee. And everyone listening today can at least help one person. We may not be able to stop the fighting. We may not be able to stop the killing and stop the humanitarian crisis all at once, but we can make a difference in one life today. And as you've mentioned, anyone who wants to do that can go to our website at worldhelp.net. We need your help. These refugees need our help. Now's not a time to debate politics. Now's the time to help people who are dying and in great, great humanitarian need.
I might just mention, as people go to your website, and let's talk that way through because that's how people are obviously going to give to you. There are a section called Ways to Give, so you might click on there. Then you can give today. There's a partnership, how to get involved. There's all sorts of ways by project, sponsorship of a child, and all the rest. And what you've been talking about is one particular way in which a gift of, $35 can provide essential material and resources, food and other resources for those. And we've talked about these refugee camps before. Talk about that for just a minute, because when we've had Johnny Moore on this program and a variety of other people, I can go through a fairly long list, certainly Joel Rosenberg and others, a lot of these individuals actually arrive at the camp with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. So we are talking about needs that are far beyond anything people in our listening audience would have ever imagined. True?
Yeah, Johnny Moore is actually a good friend of mine and partner, and he's a board member of World Health, and he is very passionate about this crisis. You know, as you mentioned, Kirby, when someone has to flee a place like Eastern Ghouta, he has to drop everything. He can't take anything with them. The only thing they can take is, or really the only thing they can think of is, I have to get my family out. I have to save my family. I have to protect my family. And so people are arriving at the camps with absolutely nothing, as you said, just the clothes on their back. And after barely escaping with their lives from besieged areas, many people simply find themselves immediately faced with another life-threatening challenge, and that's just finding enough food to survive, or clean water, or just daily essentials, medicine. And we can't abandon these refugees in their hour of greatest need. And so when we meet their physical needs of food and water and medicine, we're not only saving lives, we're also demonstrating the love of Christ. We're obeying the commands of Christ, and we literally become the hands and feet of Jesus on the ground. And I can't stress enough how much just one gift of $35 will save one refugee and help one life.
Also, talk about how we can pray for these refugees as well, because I want to mobilize many of the people in our listening audience to put that on a prayer list, to maybe tell their missions pastor to encourage prayer for that in a variety of other ways. So can you give us some direction in that regard as well?
I sure can. You know, and there's a lot of debate today, Kirby, about whether refugees should come to our country and how they should be vetted. And that's one thing we can all do is pray. It's probably the most important thing we can do is pray. The greatest thing to keep in mind when we're praying for refugees is that these are people that are really just like you and me, just like us. They have kids and grandkids. They're concerned about their safety. One of their greatest fears is that they won't be able to keep their family safe. And these aren't people who are coming from backgrounds of poverty. These refugees used to be businessmen and women and teachers and nurses, and they celebrate many of the same holidays that we do, and they have some of the same basic needs.
Yes. So
just put yourself in their shoes for a moment and think about the things you would pray for if you were in their situation. I know I would pray for my kids' safety. I'd pray for my grandchildren's safety. God, help us survive one more day. I'd pray for the opportunity for them to get back to school. Most of these refugee children aren't in school. Their schools have been destroyed or bombed, and they're living in squalid conditions. I was in one camp on the Syrian border that had 80,000 Syrian refugees in it. And so they can't go to school. We need to pray for them to come to faith in Jesus Christ. Pray that they could return to work. Pray that they'll be able to provide for their family. Pray for enough food to eat. And then pray that they would return home soon. Many of the refugees I've met carry their house keys on a key ring.
Yeah, they want to go back.
And keep it in their pocket as a reminder that they don't want to come to America. They want to go back home. And what's tragic is they carry those keys knowing that many of them don't have a home to go back to. It's been totally obliterated.
Yeah, it's just been devastated. Well, again, Vernon, I want to appreciate you taking some time to be on the program with us. We have talked about the Syrian civil war, and we've talked about the refugee crisis, and you've given us another perspective and some very good action items. Again, there's a link to worldhelp.net. You can go there directly or certainly follow the links at our website, pointofview.net. Appreciate you being on the front lines there, helping us understand what is happening in Syria, and thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby, and I pray that everyone listening right now will give today and be the hands and feet of Jesus to at least one refugee.
We'll take a break, and we will continue our conversation. All of the information we're talking about is available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. I'm going to, for just a few minutes, want to talk about the Second Amendment for no other reason than last week you have the retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens writing an op-ed in the New York Times and really advocating a position that I think a lot of individuals in the court, a lot of liberal pundits and activists have wanted to do, and that is to repeal the Second Amendment. Now, the reality is it's not going to happen, but nevertheless, I think there is another issue there, and that is there was a fair amount of what you might call historical revisionism. And if you're engaged in any kind of discussion about gun rights or gun control, I think it's helpful to kind of get the facts straight. And that's one of the reasons my commentary today is on gun violence, in which I pull some facts and figures from the FBI Uniform Crime Report, from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Just say, look, if we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have this debate or dialogue, let's at least get the right facts on the table. So I want to bring that in just a minute. But I want to look ahead to the next hour. Next hour, we have Rachel Alexander with us. She has been with us many times before, senior editor at The Stream, a political columnist and other individuals, but writes about this issue of should Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube be regulated. That is a call that I think even some conservatives are asking for, and they may want to think about what they really want to do about that. So we're going to get into that. And then also Tim Elmore will be with us. The topic, the transition from home to college. Of course, this time last week, we replayed an interview, at least in our first hour, about the Mind Games Conference that Pro Ministries does. And, of course, you have Summit Ministries and some of the others. But here's what you can be doing at home. When your kids head off to college, or even if they graduate and they're going to go into the military or just go right into the business world, there's some things that we as parents should do. So I think you'll find that very helpful. So those are the conversations that will be taking place next hour. Always like to give you a little bit of a heads up on that, especially for some of you that are driving around listening and saying, well, I'm going to have to get out of my car, and I hope the next hour isn't that interesting because I won't be able to listen to it. And you'll at least say, well, if I can't listen to it or I'm not near a radio, I can download the podcast later or watch it online or something of that nature. But let's get into this conversation about the Second Amendment. And this is, I think, a big point. David Harsenia actually said that the repeal of the Second Amendment may not be feasible, but the historical revisionism is meant to mangle its meaning into irrelevancy. And so he does a very good piece that he has written in the National Review. But the article we've posted comes from Amy Swearer, and she has done just an outstanding job in this piece called John Paul Stevens is Wrong About the Second Amendment, History and School Violence. And first of all, let's examine what he says so that we can give a reasonable response. First, he insists that the decision that came down on the Heller decision, this is known as the District of Columbia versus Heller. This came down in the Supreme Court, 2008. And John Paul Stevens, to be fair, was the dissenting opinion. In other words, the vote went against him. And he insists that the Second Amendment was centered solely on the framers' concern about threats posed by a national standing army. And as a result, he says the Second Amendment is kind of a relic of the 18th century. To put it in perspective, he would also say that it would, the 13th Amendment, the Third Amendment, it would be a relic of the 18th century because it talks about not housing military in homes. I mean, that's really not an issue that we deal with much anymore. But again, he would say that both the Second and Third Amendment really aren't even relevant to the 21st century. He then also claims that for over 200 years, the adoption of the Second Amendment was uniformly understood as not placing any limits on federal authority or state authority to enact gun control legislation. And then he actually claims that it's the National Rifle Association, that evil organization called the NRA, that concocted the theory of an individual right to keep and bear arms in order to create this fraud and actually perpetuate gun manufacturers. So there's quite a few things that he made there. Oh, by the way, he also demands that the elimination of the Second Amendment is in order to make school children safer, since that has come down on the Heller decision. So lots of points you could make, but I think Amy does a good job of breaking it down into three. And the first, she makes the case that the framers, not the NRA, are the ones that first articulated the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right. Now think about this for a minute. Before we even get into her argument, the First Amendment, is that an individual right? You know, your right to free speech. Yeah, it's an individual right. Your right to freedom of assembly. That's an individual right. Freedom of the press, well, that's sort of collective, but you have the freedom of a press as well, but so does newspapers and other people. And the freedom of religion, free exercise of religion, that's an individual right. Okay, Second Amendment, you would think that would be an individual right. Well, let's go to the Third Amendment. I just alluded to that a minute ago. The Third Amendment actually says that individuals don't have to house the military in their homes. Not something we do today, but it's an individual right. The Fourth Amendment to protect you from unreasonable search and seizure. That's an individual right. So, okay, First Amendment's individual right. Third Amendment, individual right. Fourth Amendment, individual right. You get the point. Then to argue that the Second Amendment is not an individual right, before we even get into the arguments, that doesn't make a great deal of sense. And so that's one argument that she doesn't use, but it's one that I use all the time. But she does go on to point out some other examples. For example, the argument that governments could not, that governments were not prohibited from controlling the Second Amendment at all. Well, all you have to do is go to James Madison. James Madison in Federalist Paper number 46. Now, first of all, who's James Madison? Well, James Madison was known as the architect of the Constitution. He was there at the Constitutional Convention. James Madison is the person that pushed through what came to be known as the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights. So if anybody would understand what the Bill of Rights was about, what the Constitution was about, it would be James Madison. Well, he writes about that in Federalist Paper number 46, in which he says, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments, that'd be like state and local governments, to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed, form a barrier more insurmountable than any other simple government or any other form can admit. Let's take another individual, Samuel Adams. He was certainly considered to be one of those very important individuals in the American Revolution, and certainly one of the founders. Well, Samuel Adams at the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention declared that the Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. So he's talking about the people. It has nothing to do with the militia. It has everything to do with people keeping their arms. So the first point is the framers first articulated the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right. The second point she makes is the existence of an individual right to keep and bear arms is apparent throughout nations' history. She quotes, for example, George Tucker, whose edition of Blackstone's Commentaries was kind of the commentary on the law. Blackstone's Commentaries. William Blackstone wrote a commentary on the English law, and it was used to interpret and understand American law. That says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and this without any qualification as to their condition or degree, as in the case of the British government. William Rawle, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, said no clause in the Constitution could, by any rule of construction, be conceived to give Congress a power to disarm the people. Such an attempt could only be made under some general pretense by a state legislature, but if by any blind pursuit of inordinate power either should attempt it, this amendment should be appealed to as a restraint on both. In other words, the Second Amendment prevents all of those indeed. And one more before we take a break, and I'll come to her third point in a minute. The existence of an individual right to keep and bear arms is apparent throughout the nation's history. Perhaps the best person to quote would be Joseph Story. Who's Joseph Story? Well, again, he is one of the Supreme Court leading lights, if you will. And he wrote a commentary in 1833, Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. And this is what he wrote about the Second Amendment. Joseph Story, highly regarded Supreme Court justice, said, the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered a palladium of the liberties of the Republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary powers of rulers, and will generally, even if these are successful in their first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them. So the first argument she makes is the framers, not the NRA, first articulated the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right. The second point she makes is the existence of that individual right to keep and bear arms has been apparent throughout nation's history and gives you examples in different points, especially in the 19th century. And the third point, which we'll get to after the break, is that even after this Heller decision, actually young people, students in schools, are actually safer now than they were before, which is just the opposite of what Justice John Paul Stevens argued. I need a break, but when we come back, I'll explain why that is also true, and again, is an argument against what appeared in the New York Times. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Lessons about religious liberty come in some of the most remarkable stories. For instance, a Pennsylvania town recently required its Amish citizens to hook into its public sewer system. Frankly, I never thought this would pose much of a concern, let alone a question of religious liberty, but I was wrong. It turns out the sewer system utilizes an electric pump. The Amish, for religious reasons, are not permitted to enjoy the modern conveniences of electricity. So even though their outhouse is of the traditional non-electric kind, the electrical pump of the public sewer taints the Amish privy. In fact, according to the documents filed with the court, the Amish family could be excommunicated from their religious community if they were to totally connect. Now, this is a fascinating question. Clearly, the state has a compelling interest in ensuring the proper containment and flow of sewage, but is such an interest compelling enough to overcome the substantial burden hooking into such a system would place upon the religious liberty of the Amish? It's a tough question, but I'm thankful we live in a country that pauses to consider the impact something like a sewer pump might have upon the religious liberty of its citizens. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Our national motto, "In God We Trust," is under attack. Radicals want it off police cars, money, and more. Support our national motto by going to firstliberty.org/decal to ask for your attractive In God We Trust window cling from First Liberty. Help more Americans remember that God is the foundation for America. Request your free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org/decal. Show them where you stand. That's firstliberty.org/decal.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me finish off our point here. Again, we've posted this article by Amy Swearer, which is entitled, "John Paul Stevens is Wrong About the Second Amendment History and School Violence." And, of course, the points we made just a minute ago, the framers first articulated the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right. That's how the Supreme Court ruled back in 2008 on the Heller decision. Number two, the existence of an individual right to keep and bear arms is apparent throughout nation's history, which certainly seems to contradict the argument made by Justice John Paul Stevens, saying that really for over 200 years it was uniformly understood as not placing any limits on either federal or state authority. And then the third point she makes is the Heller opinion has absolutely no negative effect on the safety of the nation's students. That was kind of the argument that also Justice John Paul Stevens was making, and that is we are worse off because of the Heller decision. Actually, just the opposite is true if you look at this various statistics. She says this perhaps is the most disappointing assertion of Justice John Paul Stevens' op-ed because it is an objective, quantitative fact that America's school children are safer today than they have been in over 3 decades, even while the number of legally owned guns per capita has increased. She says since the early 1990s, the number of students killed on school campuses has plummeted by 75%. The percentage of high school students carrying weapons to school dropped from 14% in 1993 to 4% in 2014, and the percentage of students reporting easy access to a loaded firearm at home similarly decreased. The number of shooting incidents involving students also has steadily declined. Now, again, understand when I use these facts and figures, any death by a school shooting is a tragedy. But can we get some objective facts on the table? And that brings me to my commentary, which is posted today, called Gun Violence. Because if we're going to really have an ongoing debate, and we are, about the issue of gun violence in America, and that's an important one to have, because what can we do to stem gun violence? At least we should insist on accurate facts and figures. So I make 4 points in my commentary, and again, you're free to look at that commentary, to download it. Let me encourage you to consider signing up to receive those commentaries every day so you can read them for yourself. We even have a link to where these facts come from. But let's just take each one real quickly. First, can we at least acknowledge that violent crime statistics have been dropping for many decades? Violent crime has dropped for a number of different reasons. We can get into that. A lot of media attention right now has made it sound like it's been on the upswing. And I'll be the first to admit that the last year was a little higher than the previous year. But if you look at over the last 2 or 3 decades, you've seen a very significant decline. How so? If you look at the homicide rate, for example, in 2011, that is half of the rate, almost half, I should say, what it was in 1991. If you look at the more relevant statistic, gun-related death rate in 2013, it was exactly half of the rate it was in 1993. So over 20 years, it's half of what it was. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but I hear a lot about how dangerous some very violent places are. That's very true, because one of the other statistics we've talked about is that over half of all the murders in America occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties. And a high percentage of those in those particular counties are linked either to gang activity or drug activity. So first of all, violent crime has dropped significantly in the last 2 decades. Second, a very high percentage of gun deaths are due to gun suicides. Don't take my word for it. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, each year they publish data on gun deaths. And every year, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, in some cases by 2 to 1. 2/3 gun suicides, 1/3 gun homicides. So when you look at the gun death statistics, you need to take that into account as well. Number 3, most murders and other shootings are done by handguns, not rifles. The goal right now has been to ban so-called assault rifles or other kinds of rifles or all semi-automatic. But this, again, is something that will not affect the murder rate or the shooting rate that much for this reason. Look again at the FBI Uniform Crime Report. That shows that most gun-related homicides are done with handguns. Rifles only account for less than 3% of gun-related homicides. So you can see that even if you are convinced that we need to ban all rifles, never going to happen, but even if you do believe that, it's only going to affect less than 3% if indeed those statistics are accurate, and they come from the FBI Uniform Crime Report. And then the fourth point, often we can predict what sort of person who will commit a murder or a mass shooting. For example, when we talk about murders, they fit into some very logical categories. A significant percentage of men who commit murder are in a gang or are using drugs, or they could be an abuser in a troubled relationship. Those three account for a very high percentage. What about these mass shooters? Well, again, a lot of them have extensive histories of mental illness. Now, I have a commentary coming out a week from tomorrow, but it's entitled The Crisis of Fatherless Shooters. And in there, we talk about the fact that about 70, if you look, first of all, at the 25 most cited school shooters since Columbine, 75% were actually reared in broken homes. And one psychologist actually has found that they came from incredibly broken homes, not just divorce and separation, but infidelity, substance abuse, crime, criminal behavior, domestic violence, child abuse, and the rest. So quite a bit involved there. And so, again, fatherless homes, very significant. Also in the commentary, I spend a little bit of time quoting from J. Warner Wallace, who's written a very good piece, which looks at some of the shifts that have taken place. And he also adds to this, for example, the increase in social media. In many cases, we have surveys showing that teenagers oftentimes feel bad about themselves when they're viewing social media. Many report being bullied online, so that's important. Another one which we've talked about before here is the increased dependency on prescription medicine. And while we'll certainly acknowledge that medicine has been helpful in treating mental illness, it's also worth pointing out that many of these school shooters were using or had recently stopped using prescription drugs. And, of course, we can talk about the obvious one, and that is just a complete decline in Christian values. I mean, we have a complete change in the moral foundation of America. And really, if you're a kid who's an atheist, you don't believe that there's a God, you don't believe that there's any right or wrong, you don't believe that there are any repercussions for your actions, you can see how that could be an issue as well. So, nevertheless, we've posted this article today that I thought you might find very helpful in terms of the Second Amendment. If you find yourself engaged in some kind of discussion and have somebody say, well, wait a minute, the former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens has actually called for the repeal of the Second Amendment because this idea of an individual right, that was something created by the National Rifle Association. You have some facts and figures to say, no, that's not quite accurate. Matter of fact, that's about as inaccurate as it can possibly be. And here's some other facts to look at. So, again, we hope that that's of help to you. When we come back after the break, we're going to spend some time talking with Rachel Alexander, senior editor of The Stream. What about this idea of regulating Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and others? It's something that many people think is necessary. But again, these are private companies. Got to really think that through a little bit. So we're going to spend some time talking with her, and perhaps you have some thoughts about that. And then Tim Elmore will be with us talking about the transition from home to college. So we've covered a lot of issues today. We will continue to do so, and if you'd like to find some of the articles that we've been referring to or some of the websites, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour, we want to ask a very important question, and that is, should we regulate Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube? And for the next half hour, we're going to focus on that. And if you have listened to the program any length of time, you know that in the past we've heard from Craig Parshall, who used to be at the National Religious Broadcasters, concerned about what is happening with sometimes what's called the four tech giants. And we have certainly talked with people like Kelly Shackelford and Chelsea Human about well, even though they use the public airwaves, in this case, the lines and the various internet, they are private companies, and so we should be real careful about calling for regulation. But in light of some of the things that have happened with Cambridge Analytica, we certainly are seeing that people on both sides of the aisle, both liberals and conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, are calling for some kind of regulation of maybe Facebook or others. But I think we have to be really careful about that. And so that's why one of the things that we wanted you to be able to hear is a good discussion that will come from Rachel Alexander, no stranger to this program. She's been on many times before, senior editor at The Stream, a political columnist, and an individual that was the founder and editor of Intellectual Conservative. She's been on this program with us many times before, and we have her piece that appears in The Stream, Should We Regulate Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube? And Rachel, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks, always a pleasure.
Well, let's see if we can get into this, because you know as well as I do that certainly the answer for any liberal is if there's a problem, government has to regulate that. No surprise there. What I think has become a little more surprising is some of our fellow conservatives have said, yeah, it's about time to regulate Facebook. It is a private company. We may not like all the policies of Facebook. Frankly, if you don't, go somewhere else. But when you start asking for government regulation, aren't we running into some difficulties there?
Yeah, and I think that the reason some conservatives are calling to regulate Facebook is because it discriminates against them. You know, we saw with this last recent algorithm change Facebook did in January that it disproportionately hurt conservative Facebook pages. So, and even shut down some conservative sites. But again, right, I mean, if you're a free market conservative, you shouldn't be calling for antitrust laws to break up Facebook and these other social media giants. There's got to be, in my opinion, there's got to be other ways to combat it. In my article, I go over some of the companies in the past that we thought about breaking up with antitrust laws like Microsoft and IBM, and it turned out it wasn't necessary. We didn't need to. Free market competition eventually broke them down.
Well, and again, we'll get into that whole aspect of free market. Let's give some facts and figures, because one of the things you talk about early on is that 44% of the U.S. population accesses news on Facebook. First of all, if that's the only place to get their news, they're in a real bad way. But what did you find out in terms of just the way in which some of these tech giants are starting to influence public opinion?
Well, they've replaced a lot of the major newspapers, cable news shows, whatever, in terms of where people get their news. Now everybody gets up, they log on to Facebook, and that's the first thing they do. They don't necessarily turn to their print newspaper anymore, which is dying, or they don't have cable TV because it's still kind of expensive. So people are increasingly getting their news there, and it was at first. I have another article I wrote on how social media has actually been good for conservatives, at least at first, because, you could just go and sign up for all your favorite conservative groups, and that's where you get your news now, from Facebook, all these conservative groups. But these big tech giants are tweaking their algorithms. So, remember Facebook in its trending topics was showing more liberal articles and taking out conservative articles. So they have an enormous amount of influence. And, even though, it's not a government monopoly or anything, they're just bringing back the old liberal bias to news again.
Well, and again, one of the things I say around here, and I think you would probably agree, is if you don't pay for it, then you are the product. And that's what you're starting to find is that whether it's Google or Facebook or some of the others, they're collecting information about us, data about our friends, data about our purchases, data about our searches. And as a result, they sell that data to advertisers. So I think it gets back to one of the things in my most recent booklet on privacy and surveillance. You just have to understand that's part of it as well. So some of our listeners, Rachel, have opted out of Facebook. But if you really want to be in the know, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, these are going to be important venues, whether you like them or not. Opting out might be possible for some of our listeners, but not for very many. But they have to recognize it's kind of a Faustian bargain when we get involved with them, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for many of us, if Facebook were practically dependent on it in our personal and our professional lives. I, as a journalist, could not get by without Facebook. And, you were saying how Facebook collects data about us. Well, that gets down to the question, is it really our data or is it data that they're just collecting about us? So, where necessarily are the privacy rights? Because advertisers, which, Facebook sells the information to, advertisers have always collected information about consumers. This is just a different way that they're doing it. And how damaging is the information that they're collecting about us? Who's actually being harmed or injured? Are we really being harmed or injured? These are important questions to ask, and I don't have all the answers, but I just think people need to not completely freak out and answer these questions before they come to any conclusions.
Well, and again, one of the arguments that you've heard some people make, and you've already sort of alluded to, but I thought we'd get back into it. You have one Breitbart contributor saying, well, look at what they did for Ma Bell. And again, that was a, if you will, private company, but they broke them up into baby bells. And so the argument is that monopolies like Facebook should not have the power to purge anyone. Facebook is today's town square. So again, there are some arguments that we need to think through because people are going to say what we did for the phone company, maybe even for the post office, we should be doing now for things like Facebook and Google and Twitter and YouTube. But again, we should be real careful about those kinds of arguments because in many cases, as you point out, the market solved the problem later on, didn't it?
It did. And I want to distinguish Ma Bell, where we really did go in and break them up using antitrust laws. The difference, in my opinion, there is that there are only a limited number of phone lines. So the government, was in effect granting monopoly to AT&T, Ma Bell, over those phone lines. So once the government has already stepped in and divvied up the pot, you're no longer dealing with a purely private corporation. Whereas in the case of Facebook hasn't been granted a monopoly by the government. There's not a limited amount of airwaves for Facebook to use. Any wealthy competitor, and I'm hoping one will emerge, can come in there and compete with Facebook.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, let's take some phone calls, too. Rachel will be with us a little bit longer, but then we're going to move on to some other topics. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Do you think it is time to break up Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, or just to leave it alone? We also want to come back and talk about this idea of a digital citizens' bill of rights and what that might mean, and some alternatives to government intervention, which, again, is part of this article. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about the stream, Rachel Alexander, or this particular article, visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The ongoing debate about how to stem the problem of gun violence in America has often been fueled by inaccurate statistics and faulty conclusions. If we are to craft effective public policy concerning gun violence, we should insist that accurate facts and figures be available to citizens and legislators. First, let's at least acknowledge that violent crime has been dropping for decades. Lots of recent media attention make it seem like violence is on the upswing. It is not. For example, the homicide rate in 2011 was almost half the rate in 1991. The gun-related death rate in 2013 was half of the rate in 1993. Of course, we still hear and read about how dangerous various places in America are. That is true because most of the murders are concentrated in a few areas. Over half of all murders occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and a high percentage of those murders are linked either to gang or drug activity. Second, a very high percentage of gun deaths are due to suicides. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention each year publish data on gun deaths. In every year, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes by as much as 2 to 1. Third, most murders and other shootings are done with handguns, not rifles. The FBI Uniform Crime Report shows that gun-related homicides are done with handguns, and rifles account for less than 3% of gun-related homicides. Fourth, often we can predict what sort of person who will commit a murder or a mass shooting. Significant percentages of men who commit murder are in a gang or using drugs or an abuser in a troubled relationship. A high percentage of mass shooters have extensive histories of mental illness. These facts and many others need to be included in our debate about gun violence in America. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Rachel Alexander with us for just a few more minutes, and we're asking the question, should we regulate Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or should we break it up? Let's take some phone calls along the way. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Maine, first of all, WSEW. Steve, what do you think?
Well, hi. Thank you for taking my call. I think this is just an opinion, and I mean, it's very not based on any data, really. It's just an opinion.
It's okay.
But I think if you were to regulate Facebook or Twitter or any of those social media outlets, I think regulation would equal fees, and I think you would end up seeing a huge drop off in the use if that was to happen. It's just a thought.
I think it's a good one.
I would think that.
Yeah, I mean, again, Rachel, what do you think about that? Because, you know, one of the, like I said, if the service you're getting is free, then sometimes you're the product. Well, we understand that. But again, somebody had to figure out how to monetize some of these tech giants, and some were successful and some were not. A few were successful, most were not. It's probably a better way to say that. But if I have all sorts of regulation to Facebook, then they'd say, okay, well, if you want to be on Facebook, then you need to, pay a certain amount per month, and you know what would happen then. So that's another kind of downside of any kind of government regulation of some of these tech giants, isn't it?
Yeah, the caller brings up a really good concept that I had not thought of. And, the government is great at passing along costs to companies, and it would pass along the regulation costs to Facebook, and Facebook would then pass it on to the consumer. And I'd also just like to add and point out one other thing that worries me about having the government regulate Facebook is instead of having Facebook that's pick winners and losers and in politics and topics and things, you now have the government doing it, and we know how biased the government can be against conservatives.
Oh, boy. We all know that, of course, don't we? Let's, if we can, get into a couple other issues. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things that you have a whole section here on what to do, and one of those is something that we've only mentioned on this program, and since you've obviously studied a little bit, talk about this idea of a digital citizens' bill of rights. I've heard it mentioned from time to time, but you've obviously studied it, so talk about its genesis and what it might look like.
Yeah, it came up from a couple people out there, and there's versions of it in Congress. They might have different names to them, but oh gosh, I'm trying to think of the guy who writes for WorldNet Daily. He's been one of the ones who proposed it. His name escapes me. But basically, what it would do is it would translate your privacy rights from the Constitution into a version online. And it would say what a company can and cannot do with your personal data, and it would basically give you more control over your personal data and how companies use it.
So again, that would be something that would be there. And apparently the European Union has passed something like that, hasn't it?
Yeah, they've got their general data protection regulation, and it goes into effect in May. So we'll see how well this really does pan out.
So again, just a couple of issues to look at. Joseph Farah, is that who you're thinking of? At WorldNet Daily?
No.
Okay, I was going to say, well, we'll look it up anyway. But your article there really talks about this idea. And first of all, I know one of the other points you make is if you break up Facebook, where do you stop? Apple and Google have over 99% of the global market for smartphones. They, too, collect personal data. You know, sometimes you not only have to look at the policy that you're implementing, but the long-range implications of that policy as well. And so that's just one more illustration of why this would be a really bad idea, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you have the government picking winners and losers at that point if you're going to go after Facebook, but no one's saying anything about Apple and Google.
So again, a couple of issues. What you point out here real quickly is also that there were attempts to sort of break up IBM with antitrust laws, to break up Microsoft even, and of course we mentioned Apple. We've got some pretty good examples of when a private company is abusing the market in one way or another. The market reacts appropriately, and individuals are reacting. And just the fact is that this is not a good time to be a leader in Facebook, is it? Because of the kind of testimony that's going to have to take place in front of Congress.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, these are, other tech companies, that were broken up on their own through competition, Microsoft and IBM. And there's no reason to think that the same thing isn't going to happen to Facebook, especially considering how fast technology is advancing. There's going to be some new, hipper, sleeker company that comes out and defeats Facebook. I mean, look what happened to, I can't remember the name because we never hear about it anymore, but that it was like Facebook and like all the
MySpace.
MySpace,
there
yeah,
you go.
They got beaten by Facebook, and no one even uses them anymore.
Yeah, well, again, it's not a good time to be Mark Zuckerberg, but we shared in the first hour how he said that his inspiration for the design of Facebook came from Psalm 139. That caught me completely off guard, but nevertheless, I don't think he'll be sharing that when he goes in front of Congress. And I think your piece is just a real good antidote to this idea that we certainly, in every case, need government to come in and regulate us. And so I think it's a really good piece. Just before I go, though, let me also encourage people to go to the stream and talk about some of the other articles you're working at, or a couple of others that we need to be aware of, because I have certainly been over these last couple of years pointing people to the stream so that they can find really good articles, not only written by you, but by a variety of other people. John Smerick has been on the program with us in studio occasionally. Jay Richards did a whole series just recently on fasting, but before that has talked about economic issues. And, of course, all sorts of other writers. It's just a great place to find some good material. But talk about some of the things that we will find when we land on the stream website.
Well, definitely click on my archives, because I do have an article recently on how Facebook is censoring Christians and conservatives and the other social media giants as well. And I just had one come out Saturday on how if you try to post an ad on Facebook that contains an image of the crucifixion, it could be some old revered photo from the 1500s. Facebook is increasingly rejecting these ads, saying that they're violent. And then I'm working right now on an article on the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. That's going to be for April 4th is the date.
Well, very good. Rachel, I always appreciate the good work that you do, appreciate your articles, and thank you for getting a few minutes of your time today and giving it to us and talking about this idea of whether we should regulate Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So keep writing, and we'll keep calling you, and appreciate the great work that you do.
Thank you. God bless.
Just before we take a break, you might have also noticed that there was a piece that came out just the other day. Hey, Alexa, what can you hear and what will you do with it? That's another one of those questions that's being surfaced. Appeared in the New York Times, where one of the writers said that Amazon ran a commercial on this year's Super Bowl that pretended its digital assistant, that's Alexa, had temporarily lost her voice. It featured all sorts of celebrities, and you probably saw that as well, including the company's chief executive, Jeff Bezos. While the ad, she says, riffed on what Alexa can say to users, the more intriguing question may be what she and other digital assistants can hear, especially as more people bring smart speakers into their homes. Amazon and Google, the leading sellers of such devices, say the assistants record and process audio only after users trigger them by pushing a button or ushering a phrase like, "Hey, Alexa," or "Okay, Google." But each company has filed patent applications, many of them still under consideration, that outline an array of possibilities for how devices like these could monitor more of what users say and do. That information could be used to identify a person's desires or interests, which could be mined for ads and product recommendations. In one set of applications, Amazon described what's called a voice sniffer algorithm. Could be used on an array of devices like tablets and e-book readers to analyze audio almost in real time when it hears words like love or bought or dislike and those kinds of things. Some patent applications also, which again could relate to some of the other things like Nest Labs and all that, describe how audio and visual signals could be used for smart home setups. One application details how monitoring could detect that a child is engaged in mischief at home using speech patterns. Another one would try to determine a speaker's mood using the volume of the user's voice, detecting breathing rate, and even some to determine your medical condition based on detecting coughing, sneezing, and so forth. That's almost like you got a robot when you bring in the Echo Dot or you bring in Google Home, but nevertheless, just one more question that we'll have to deal with in the technology of the 21st century. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I want to end the program today by talking about this transition from home to college. What can you do in your home? What can you do in your school and in your church to help that? And, of course, we also have been promoting the Pro Mind Games Conference taking place in June. If you have a young person heading off to college this year or next year, I think it would be a great week spent to really prepare them for what they're going to encounter. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation, in this case with Tim Elmore. All that coming up right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles we posted was wrong about the Second Amendment. I thought I'd get to one more before we get to our conversation with Tim Elmore, and that is about paid maternity leave. And it is interesting because the original title for the George Will column was Paid Maternity Leave, Your Baby Will Get the Bill, which I thought was a good turn of phrase. Some of you others will say something a little bit different. But he says, in a recent bipartisan budget agreement, which signals that 12-digit deficits are acceptable to both parties, even when the economy is robust. And think about that for a minute. It's one thing to say that, well, Democrats were okay with major deficits. Now Republicans are as well. But anyway, he says, which signals the 12-digit deficits are acceptable to both parties, even when the economy is robust, indicates government's future. So does government's pregnancy, which was announced 9 months ago by this tweet from Senator Marco Rubio. In America, Marco Rubio says, no America should be forced to put off having children due to economic insecurity. Well, the phrase due to economic insecurity is a way of avoid saying until they can afford them. Evidently, it is now retrograde to expect family planning to involve families making plans that fit their resources, which brings us to the approaching birth of a new entitlement, paid family leave after the birth or adoption of a child. This coincides with gargantuan deficits produced primarily by existing entitlements. And he goes on to say that still the president has promised to oppose the House Speaker Paul Ryan and the party's proclaimed determination to address the entitlement crisis, but the president has endorsed paid family leave. And, of course, you have a number of states and even the District of Columbia that do that. But the problem with this, of course, is it will ratchet up government dramatically. He says 25 years ago, Washington made many workers eligible for 12 weeks of unpaid leave, all but guaranteeing that many, and the absence of pay could come to seem to retrograde. The current administration speaks of 6 weeks of paid leave. Democrats fancy 12, a likely compromise 18, which goes the other direction. And Penna Dexter has a commentary coming out this weekend. She'll be on, and we'll probably discuss this more on Friday on our weekend edition. The debate will concern ways to disguise the benefits cost while requiring others to pay for it. And so her commentary and, of course, the George Will commentary are those which we have posted. But let's, if we can, now go to Tim Elmore. He's been on the program with us before as we talked about his book, Artificial Maturity, Helping Kids Meet the Challenge of Becoming Authentic Adults. He is the founder of Growing Leaders. You can go to growingleaders.com, and really has been all about trying to cultivate leadership activities and abilities for young adults, author of more than 30 books, and talking about this transition from home to college. Tim, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
What can we do to help our young people? The other day we did a program on Probe's Mind Games Conference where young people can go and spend a week, if they're in junior, senior in high school, getting ready for college in terms of some of the challenges they're going to face. Of course, Summit Ministries has a 2-week program as well. But a lot of what needs to take place long before they go to one of these week conferences. It needs to take place in the home and in the church. What might you begin to suggest in terms of laying the groundwork? Because you have kind of a month-by-month program of what you can begin to do. Talk about that.
Well, I recently did a blog post that's gotten quite a few shares where I talk about a ramp-up time of conversations and experiences that a mom or a dad or a teacher could do with students who are preparing to move from what we call backpack to briefcase or from high school to college. And I really believe there needs to be intentional conversations. And in our rat race of a world today, we just often don't have time for these. We're off to rehearsal or practice or something, and we never get them done. So, yeah, I think I actually start in the month of March where we talk about hopes and dreams. And what I do, what I recommend is there is a metaphor, a travel metaphor that you use to kind of be the focal point. So my travel metaphor to initiate this conversation is windshields and rearview mirrors. And what I mean by that is when you're driving in a car, you know that you have to glance at the rearview mirror, but you gaze out the windshield, not the other way around. I remember when my dad first taught me how to drive, I got mesmerized by the rearview mirror and almost had an accident. So we talk about, where does your energy come from, the past or the future? Most kids are excited about the future, but they're also scared. And sometimes we get our energy from the past. I won a trophy my sophomore year of high school, or I got injured my junior year of high school. It could be bad or good memories, and we just talk about how do we begin to focus on the future well. Anyway, so I give a month-by-month journey. I'll let you volley back, but I really want to encourage parents that are listening or teachers that are listening to have these intentional conversations to get them ready with budget, with time, with accountability partners, with their vision and planning for the future. All of that's important.
Might just mention again, we have a link to growingleaders.com. And since we're in the month of April, you're going to have to catch up because, of course, we talked about windshields and rearview mirrors. But let's talk about the next one because I love your metaphor here, sturdy guardrails. Those are to keep you on track. And the bottom line is, and you know this, Tim, and having spent many years speaking on college campuses and also speaking at Probe Mind Games conferences, Summit Ministries, and other college things, college freshmen get overwhelmed. They make incredibly poor decisions. So what about this idea of guardrails for just a minute?
Well, I believe that we all need guardrails to stay on the right road. We need it with our cars sometimes. We need them in life. And what I suggest for this month is a discussion about accountability. We need people and standards in our life that help us make good decisions, that keep us on the right road. So just like a guardrail keeps you from veering off a cliff or down a ravine, these people in your life that you invite in, and by the way, it could be a family member. Maybe it's a talk with an uncle, once a month from the college dorm. Maybe it's a friend who's a junior in college, not a freshman like you. But these are conversations where you specifically say, these are the issues that I need to talk about to keep me on track. Some kids, their freshman year, go to too many parties. I'm just saying, I'm not saying. So, how do I make sure that I'm, putting in study time and the right social time? It's all the stuff we get, but freshmen will often sign up for everything rather than something. And that's the guardrail people are the kind of people we need in our life to keep us accountable to make good decisions.
Well, it moves you through March and April. Let's, if we can, just maybe get one or two more before we take our next break.
Sure.
And May, discussion about budget, and there's the Uber ride. Living on your own can introduce hardships due to poor spending habits. Oh, that's certainly the case. And really, if you're going to go Uber, you need to know how much the ride costs, and you will find out how much it costs before you get in the car. That's really important when you get deluged with all these credit card applications and all these incredible ways to spend your money.
So the Uber ride conversation is a fun one to have. We all know now that whether it's a taxi or an Uber ride, it's really wise to find out how much the ride's going to cost. With your phone, you can, get the Uber app and you know how much it's going to cost. Good move. Far too often we send our kids off and we give them money every month or whatever, but they've never learned to budget. And so this is just a conversation where I suggest the activity on this one is have them lay out a budget. What are the 7 or 8 expenses you're going to have every month that you know you're going to have? And then I ask the student to the parent to defend that decision. Why do you need pizza money that much? Or why do you need this money or that money? But I just think it's getting them ready for the future. I feel like we've done a lot better job protecting our kids than preparing our kids for these times. And budgeting is just a must. And I think an Uber ride is a great illustration of, how much that ride's going to cost before you hop in that car, just like you need to go to college that way.
And that budget is sort of helpful, too. I remember when my kids were very young, and I'd say, okay, here's what we're going to give you for your allowance, how much you're going to give for your tithe, how much you're going to do this and this and that. And so at a very young age, they were learning that. Or for those of you that are a little bit older, you might remember the Cosby Show where he was trying to show his son, how he thinks it's all going to come together. He keeps taking money out of his hand, and all of a sudden he realizes he has nothing left. So those questions and discussions about a budget, which you apply before they go to college, will last them for the rest of their life. And so that is such a key one. Talking, of course, about what you look through the windshield, what you look through the rearview mirror, the other one about guardrails and an Uber ride. Let's take a break. Come back. We're only getting you to May, but then we're going to go June, July, August at the very least. And again, talk about some of the great resources that are available on the website, growingleaders.com. And if you haven't already gone to that website, let me recommend it. And Tim will be here to explain a little bit more what's on the website. Let me commend to you a number of his books. Of course, I mentioned the one that we've talked about before, which people had recommended to me. And of course, we've done interviews with him in the past on artificial maturity, but also Generation IY, Secrets to Connecting with Today's Teens and Young Adults in the Digital Age, something we talk about oftentimes in our Millennial Roundtable on Wednesdays. 12 Huge Mistakes Parents Can Avoid, Life-Giving Mentors, and Nurturing the Leader Within Your Child. Just a couple of the many books that he has published. We'll come back and make your way through June, July, and August before you send those kids off to college. All that coming up as we continue our conversation with Tim Elmore right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Lessons about religious liberty come in some of the most remarkable stories. For instance, a Pennsylvania town recently required its Amish citizens to hook into its public sewer system. Frankly, I never thought this would pose much of a concern, let alone a question of religious liberty, but I was wrong. It turns out the sewer system utilizes an electric pump. The Amish, for religious reasons, are not permitted to enjoy the modern conveniences of electricity. So even though their outhouse is of the traditional non-electric kind, the electrical pump of the public sewer taints the Amish privy. In fact, according to the documents filed with the court, the Amish family could be excommunicated from their religious community if they were to totally connect. Now, this is a fascinating question. Clearly, the state has a compelling interest in ensuring the proper containment and flow of sewage, but is such an interest compelling enough to overcome the substantial burden hooking into such a system would place upon the religious liberty of the Amish? It's a tough question, but I'm thankful we live in a country that pauses to consider the impact something like a sewer pump might have upon the religious liberty of its citizens. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Our national motto, In God We Trust, is under attack. Radicals want it off police cars, money, and more. Support our national motto by going to firstliberty.org/decal to ask for your attractive In God We Trust window cling from First Liberty. Help more Americans remember that God is the foundation for America. Request your free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org/decal. Show them where you stand. That's firstliberty.org/decal.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have Tim Elmore with us for just a few more minutes, president of Growing Leaders. And again, we'll talk a lot more about the website in just a minute. But he has published a piece just kind of laying the groundwork month by month to help your child before he or she goes off to college. And we've talked about March, April, and May. Let's get into the summer months for just a minute. June is one of those, a discussion about values and ethics. And here you can use a GPS or a compass, which, again, are instruments to help you kind of navigate through life. And certainly they need to know how to navigate through some of the decisions they're going to be making before they go off to college and when they're in college.
No doubt about it. Most of us know that a freshman in college, for the first time in their life, mom and dad aren't around. They're kind of away from home. Maybe they're living in a residence hall. So I love this double metaphor, a compass or a GPS. Both have to do with navigation, as you just mentioned, but the difference is this. A GPS is helpful if you know the destination you're going to. You punch in the address, and it tells you turn left, turn right, turn left, turn right until you get there. But what if you're in brand new territory? What if you're kind of sketchy on where you want to end up? You don't know what that career goal should be. I believe we need to send our kids off with a compass, not just a GPS. And by that, I mean a moral compass. I remember getting a GPS on my phone for the first time, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'll never get lost the rest of my life. What I discovered is within the first month of having that GPS on my phone, I was lost as a goose. And it was because I was in some very remote place in Saskatchewan, Canada at the time, and there were dirt roads and there were no names on the roads. At that point, I got a compass on my phone. And you know what a compass is? It's an instrument that tells you where your true north is, wherever you are, even when there's no roads at all. I believe we need to send our kids off with a great discussion on what are your values? What are those ethical boundaries that you're going to live by on Friday night or whenever that you've owned? You own them. It's not borrowing mom and dad. You own them. And so I recommend a discussion where you sit down over dinner or coffee and you say, why don't you list 4 to 6 words that describe the man or the woman you want to become, that describe the kind of lifestyle you want to live, so that going into this, you've got your true north, not, when you're on Friday night and now you're trying to figure out what you really believe and what you really think. So anyway, this just fosters a wonderful, I had this discussion with my son and daughter. I'll never forget my son before he left for his senior year of college out in L.A., way across the country from where we live in Atlanta. I said, Jonathan, do you have your, and I couldn't even finish my sentence. And he said, Dad, I've got my compass on the inside. And I knew exactly what he meant. He meant, I've got my values that I'm going to live by. And it was just so encouraging to know he knew how to make his way through life without Dad around, because he had it on the inside of him.
Very good. A couple more real quickly. July, toll booths and roadblocks, because after all, these are the challenges that they face, and they're going to have bumps in the road. They're going to have blocked places where they aren't going to be able to go. They're going to be locked doors, but there'll also be open doors, and we can change the metaphor a little bit. But again, there will be either a roadblock stopping you in your tracks or a toll booth, which will cause you to pay the price, right?
Yep, no doubt about it. So every freshman, or every new college student, I should say, plans out their college career, but we never plan on difficulties, do we? I'm going to major in math, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But you and I both know challenges are going to come. So I believe every adversarial situation, every obstacle we come in contact with will either become a roadblock where we just get stuck and we never move forward, we never grow past, or it becomes a toll booth where we pay a price and we keep moving forward. So this is a great discussion on how are they going to handle the times when they get stuck. It's a bad grade on a test. It's a sour relationship. It's whatever happens. And all of these things will happen at some point in the next 4 years. This was the greatest conversation I had with my kids. And we talk about how are they going to make progress and how are they going to pay the price when they face these obstacles. And it's very tempting just to make it a roadblock and they drop out of college, or they get emotionally or spiritually stuck. So I'll stop there, but this toll booths or roadblocks is an image I carry in my mind as a midlife adult for the obstacles I face at this point in my life.
Very good. One last one, August, just before they head off to school. This one is tour guides and travel agents, because, again, finding mentors, and that's the difference, because one goes with you, the other tells you from afar. So it doesn't always have to be a mentor there at the university, but it is somebody that is having a profound impact in your life. But it's also some people that are around you when you have your college experience.
No doubt. I believe one of the greatest decisions I made, and this was way back yonder many years ago, when I arrived on the college campus, was I began to select mentors. Some were professors, one was a pastor, one was a friend in the community that was older than I was. But boy, those mentors were my tour guides. They went with me on the journey. So this is a discussion on finding the right mentors once you get to that campus. And once again, mom and dad are probably not close by. But boy, this is just a great conversation that I wish every parent would have with their child just before they leave for college.
Well, again, if people wanted to know a little bit more about what you are developing and have developed over the years at Growing Leaders, they can go to growingleaders.com. And there's just a lot of material at the website. So give people a little bit of an overview of what they will find when they land on the website and how they can use that to prepare their kids.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, this little discussion we just had is a free article on our website. It's one of my blogs. And if you'll just note, the title is A Game Plan to Prepare Yourself and Your Child to Head Off to College. Those words will cause that article to pop up, and you can print it off for free or download it. But this is all from a book I did called Habitudes for the Journey. There's actually 13 images, all travel metaphors that are just preparing students for transition from middle school to high school to college, even college to career, where they're going to have to really navigate change and the stress that comes with change. So Habitudes for the Journey might be a book that's very helpful to launch these kinds of conversations. But I so appreciate you directing them to the website. We have lots of free things as well as things you can purchase. It is growingleaders.com, and our goal is to help adults equip the students to be ready for life and leadership.
Well, again, Habitudes, a great resource that I failed to mention earlier, so thank you for bringing it up. Of course, I've always appreciated your book, Artificial Maturity, and some of the other writings, and, of course, the great resource there, growingleaders.com. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get some more of that material, it's all available at your website. We, of course, have a link on our website, pointofview.net. Tim, thank you for being so creative, and thank you for the heart that you have for young people. We appreciate you joining us today and look forward to the next opportunity.
Sounds great. Have a great day. Good to be with you.
That's all we have for today. Let me just mention that some of the articles that we have mentioned are available at the website. Some of the links that you will certainly find as helpful are there as well, and it's all part of our website, pointofview.net. And I just encourage you to take the time to find some of those resources and use those effectively, because they will be so key to really help a young person heading off to college. As you know, my heart is also, of course, in the Probe Mind Games Conference. We've done interviews about that. You can go to probe.org to find out some more. That's happening in June. And really, if you can just have a young person in your life give up just 1 week. I know sometimes people say, well, I'm not sure I can go 2 weeks up to Summit Ministries, and that's a little more expensive. Well, this one is a 1 week event that really is more personable. And if you haven't had a chance to sign up your children or grandchildren to that, I hope that you'll check that out at probe.org. And, of course, the Mind Games Conference taking place in June. But this is a game plan so that you can prepare young people right now for what they're going to be encountering, and that's something that can be taking place at home. Doug, I want to thank you for your help behind the scenes. Steve, thank you as well. That's all we have for today. Hey, we have Josh McDowell on the program tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. So we'll see you then, right here on Point of View.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.